But I come to speak in opposition to the legislation before us today, the tax reconciliation bill, and one of the requirements of the legislation that I most ardently oppose is including the Arctic Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas development. This bill basically pays for the tax cuts for corporations and millionaires by raising taxes on the middle class, undermining health care, and requiring drilling in our nation's most iconic national wildlife refuge. Everyone should understand that the vote for this reconciliation bill is a vote to go to the heart, the biological heart of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge and require drilling. I believe that opening up the refuge to oil drilling is being done as a supposed revenue raiser to offset the soaring costs of this tax bill for corporations and the wealthy. But the process that it went through is a sham. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that drilling for oil in the Arctic will raise less than $1 billion over 10 years. This doesn't even meet the $1 billion reconciliation instruction, and it certainly doesn't represent a serious offset to the huge deficits in the bill. To put that into perspective, less than 0.07% of the $1.5 trillion increase in the national debt will be from this policy in this legislation. So, drilling in the Arctic really has nothing to do with a serious budget policy. It has everything to do with evading regular order to pass something that could never, through the regular order of legislative process, pass. In addition to drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, this bill would sell 7 million barrels of oil from our nation's strategic petroleum reserve. A portion of that sale is simply to meet the reconciliation instructions, that is to say, to make this bill work. But the sale of oil from our petroleum reserve would provide also $300 million of windfall to 4 states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So this bill is selling off oil in order to pay for oil drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. I do not believe that makes sense. Under this sham process, the bill will turn one of our nation's wildest and most pristine areas into an oil field. The Arctic Wildlife Refuge is the largest refuge in our nation and one of the crown jewels for us in the United States for wildlife refuges. I believe it is a U.S. Serengeti. We received a letter that I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. President, from Jane Goodall, who basically said, quote, "Around the globe, so many indigenous people have been harmed in the name of progress. Let us not add one more tragedy to that list. We have other sources of energy," end quote. And I'd like to enter in the record the entire letter.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the refuge, describes it as the only conservation system unit that protects, in an undisturbed condition, a complete spectrum of the Arctic ecosystem in North America. It is home to incredible diversity of wildlife, 47 different species of mammals, including polar bears, grizzly bears, wolves, Dall sheep, moose, musk ox, and caribou. And the Arctic Wildlife Refuge provides important habitat for over 40 species of fish and more than 200 species of migratory birds. So why would we want to destroy this refuge? It was first established by the Eisenhower administration, and Congress later protected this amazing Arctic area and its ecosystem to protect the wildlife and protect the habitat because of its incredible diversity. The Arctic Wildlife Refuge is really known as the last great wilderness in our country, one of the great last wild places. But this legislation turns that on its head. It would make oil and gas development one of the statutory purposes of the wildlife refuge. And under this legislation, This refuge would become the only refuge where oil and gas development is required by law. It opens up an entire 1.5 million acre coastal plain for gas and exploration leasing of at least 800,000 acres. It requires leasing of areas with the highest oil and gas production, no matter what the consequences for the wildlife or the environment. And the bill requires that the Arctic National Wildlife be managed as a petroleum reserve, which is unprecedented, undercuts management, and is not consistent with the refuge management of wildlife. This bill includes no clear requirements to comply with environmental laws or to protect wildlife. Its sponsors, however, are saying they are not preempting environmental laws that, in fact, like the National Environmental Policy Act, will fully apply. But this bill undercuts those assurances of compliance with environmental laws by adding oil development as the purpose of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. Adding oil development as a purpose is contrary to the purpose of a wildlife refuge. The purpose of a wildlife refuge is to protect wildlife and to make sure the managers of wildlife do so in a management fashion. At every other wildlife refuge in the country, development within the refuge is only permitted to the extent compatible with protecting wildlife. So this bill tries to waive one of the most important management protections that apply to every other wildlife refuge, that development must be compatible. And they do this because they know that oil and gas development in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge is not compatible. It's just the opposite. It's important to note that this bill does not also provide any energy security. There's no prohibition in the bill against exporting oil from the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. In all likelihood, much of the oil will be exported. In addition to opening up the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to development, the bill also requires 7 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to give $300 million, as I mentioned earlier, to several states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So, at the same time, we're being told we must ruin a national wildlife refuge because we need the oil. We are selling oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It just does not make sense for America. It just doesn't add up. The impact of oil and gas exploration in the wildlife area and the danger to our wildlife cannot be overstated. The Arctic Wildlife Refuge coastal plain and nearby waters are designated as critical habitat for polar bears, which are listed as threatened and under the Endangered Species Act. Female polar bears headed to the Arctic Wildlife Refuge coastal area so they can create snow dens where they give birth to the young. And the Arctic Wildlife Refuge has a higher concentration of polar bear denning and habitat than any other area on Alaska's North Slope. The refuge is also summer calving grounds for the porcupine caribou herd. And this herd's range extends into Canada, and we actually have a treaty between both our countries to protect this herd. The almost 200,000 herd has an annual migration of hundreds of miles, and in some cases thousands of miles, wintering in the south of the refuge. Now, I think this herd of caribou is so important because scientists say that they have an entirely different kind pattern than other caribou in Alaska, that they have been adept at dealing with the adaptation that comes along with climate change. Why not, instead of ruining their habitat, study and understand this migration that has been studied since the 50s? It has been part of our national investment in understanding wildlife. It's been supported by both Democrat and Republican administrations to understand the science and background of this caribou herd. And these caribou are important food sources for many Alaska natives, in particular the Gwich'in people who live south of the refuge. Wildlife biologists argue that the risk to the caribou herd and those who rely on them could be quite significant. So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? The last few years have been a difficult budget situation in Alaska. Relying on oil for 90% of the budget, I agree, is unsustainable. And every dollar the price of oil per barrel drops, the state budget, it drops by $30 million, or close to 1 percentage point per dollar. The General Revenue Fund in Alaska dropped over 80% in 2012, and that situation caused Alaska's $4 billion deficit projection last year. So difficult choices had to be made about taxes, savings, spending, and what the state government should do. Thankfully, their economy hasn't collapsed. But in the last big oil-driven recession in the 1980s, Alaska's banks failed and housing prices collapsed and 15% of the population left. Why am I bringing this up? Well, because the good news is in today's Alaska economy, it's more diverse than it was 30 years ago. I know this because I talk to my colleagues and because we're interacting in a lot of ways in the Pacific Northwest. Alaska is well known for its tourism. 2 million visitors to Alaska spend $1,000 per person in the state, supporting a $7 billion outdoor industry. My colleagues here may not realize what my colleagues from Alaska and Washington know, and that is that the state of Alaska and Washington have a lot of interdependence. A recent study found that 113,000 jobs in Puget Sound are tied to Alaska's economy, and this number has doubled in the last 30 years. So what are those jobs? A quarter of those are in the seafood industry. Almost 1,000 commercial fishermen that work in Alaska fisheries are part of the trade between us. Alaska trade accounts for 1 in 5 containerized ships that travel through the Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma. 14,000 jobs are tied to passenger transportation, including 430,000 passenger cruise ships that come through Puget Sound every year. So that's just one way of saying the Washington and Alaska economy are tied together. And as a hub for Arctic commerce, I've worked with my colleague, Senator Murkowski, and Senator Sullivan on issues like a new Coast Guard Arctic icebreakers that are so needed for the future. And I've supported more funding for demonstration of renewable energy and microgrids in an effort to help the local economy. I feel the same way about rural broadband across the nation, and we want to make sure that we're deploying and helping with everything we can to bring more connectivity to Alaska. But I really question how opening the Arctic Wildlife Refuge is a solution to that problem. Even under CBO's aggressive view, if leasing occurs in the refuge, it will be many years before Alaskans see any significant revenue. So my colleagues should be aware that doubling down on oil by sacrificing one of the great wildlife refuges won't help close Alaska's budget deficit, and it won't help them diversify for the future. This Arctic Wildlife Refuge is just too special. It's too important. It's one of the crown jewels of our National Wildlife Refuge system. We should be preserving it. We should not be destroying it. We should not be turning it into an oil field. I am reminded that many people over many decades have fought for this great area of our country to maintain its environmental stewardship, starting with Olaus Murray, who went there and did great exploration that convinced many people here in this Washington that it was something so special worth preserving. After decades of his scientific exploration in Alaska, Olaus testified in the Senate in 1959 in support of creating the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. He said, quote, "We long for something more, for something that has a mental and a spiritual impact on us. This idealism, more than anything else, will set us apart as a nation for striving for something worthwhile in the universe." End quote. So what is setting us apart today? some very short-term gains. In 100 years, when this economic tax bill will long be forgotten, the question will be whether something important in the universe still exists in the Arctic wildlife area. We didn't create the Arctic coastal plain, but I can tell you this, we cannot recreate it. What we're doing today is taking a step towards destroying it. I urge my colleagues to oppose this reconciliation bill. Do not sacrifice the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to oil development. Don't take one of the great, wild, pristine places on this planet and turn it into an oil field. We can do better as a nation. I know we can do better as a region, and we can do better with a better Arctic strategy for our nation's future. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.